instructions on how to access French, Arabic, or Portuguese interpretation on your screen. We will get started in approximately 3 minutes. Welcome to the October edition of the Emerging Practice webinar series here at the Regional GBV Working Group for East and Southern Africa. We do have French, Arabic, and Portuguese interpretation available. You can find instructions on how to access French, Arabic, or Portuguese translation on your screen. You must go to the bottom of your screen and find the interpretation icon. Once you click on that, you will find either English, French, Arabic, or Portuguese. We will get started in approximately 1 to 2 minutes. I see that we still have people who are joining, and we'll give them a few minutes. We will get started in approximately 1 to 2 minutes. Thanks for joining, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. We will get started in approximately 1 minute. Please note, we do have Arabic, French, and Portuguese interpretation available today. You can find the instructions on your screen about how to access interpretation. We will get started in approximately 1 minute. I see that we have still people who are joining. Okay, I think we will get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Gorham, and I'm the Regional Emergency GBV Advisor based here at UNFPA in Nairobi, covering East and Southern Africa. I am also the chair of the Regional GBV Working Group for East and Southern Africa. And I'm pleased to see so many people on the line today joining us for our October installment of our Emerging Practice webinar series. Please note we do have French, Arabic, and Portuguese interpretation available today. The instructions on how to access interpretation can be found on your screen. You must go to the bottom of your screen, click on the interpretation icon, and then you'll see a list of English, French, Portuguese, and Arabic. And a big thank you to UNICEF, our member organization, who is sponsoring and funding our interpretation for our Emergent Practice webinar series and also all of our learning events throughout the year. We are very appreciative because we know it broadens also our audience as well. So thank you again to UNICEF for providing interpretation to all of these amazing learning events. Next slide, please, Adish. I'm really excited that today we have Claire Brown joining us from the International Pride Center. She's going to be talking a little bit about legal precedent and best practices for serving LGBTQI plus GBV survivors. I attended a workshop a couple of weeks ago that was held here in Nairobi that was facilitated by the International Pride Center. And I really appreciated, and I think Claire's going to probably go over some of this today, but I really appreciated how they framed some of the legal precedent, especially in our region, East and Southern Africa, but more importantly, how organizations can have a broader understanding of the legalities of some of these laws and policies in place that are against the LGBTQI plus community, and how we can still deliver services in those contexts. And Claire, this is a question that we often get asked by our member organizations, particularly local and national organizations who are our frontline service providers, wondering how they can still meet the needs of this very important population, but then also recognizing that we have a lot of barriers in place as well. So just like all of our other events, please note, we will have Adish, my colleague Adish, who will be monitoring the chat in French. I will be monitoring the chat in English. If you have any questions, please do write your questions in the chat. Towards the end of the webinar, we will group like questions together and then present them to Claire at the end of the webinar, given the time that we have. If we are able to answer those questions in real time, we certainly will do that as well. So without any further delay, I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Claire Brown from the International Pride Center. She is joining us from another time zone, so we're really appreciative that she's also up at a very early time in the morning and with us today. It's very appreciated. And I will now turn it over to Claire.
Thank you so much. And hi, no, I'm very happy to get up and join. I'm excited to present and to discuss this topic. Thank you so much for the opportunity. So as Jessica said, I'm Claire Brown. I am the Legal and Policy Advisor for the International Pride Center. And I'll just start by giving you a little bit of background about what that organization is. We're quite new, so many of you may not have heard of us. We've existed since January of this year. And our focus is on LGBTQ inclusion in humanitarian settings. So, refugee camps, IDP camps, and trying to think through probably many of the problems and challenges that you may be grappling with, whereby, first of all, people that are from the LGBTQ community in these types of settings face many more barriers to the people around them just in accessing general services. If you think of, for example, a group of trans people in a refugee camp, which is a demographic that I have been talking to a lot recently, it is very difficult for them to just go and get the food rations at the same time as everybody else, which means they're more likely to enter into precarious forms of work, including sex work, which means they're more likely to contract HIV, which means they need greater health services, but then health facilities are much more likely to discriminate against them. So these challenges just become more and more compounded. And our role is to support humanitarians operating in those environments on how can they ensure they best serve those communities. And that includes a focus on thinking through how best to respond to gender-based violence that's committed against members of the community, which is they're very highly susceptible to it. And so that's something that we're also going to, I think, talk about in this session. Just to explain how we see our role in all of this. We do not provide direct services to communities. What we do is we support humanitarian and development organizations who do that through a variety of different ways, including advising them on ensuring their programming is inclusive to, SOGIESC, that acronym is sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. It is a mouthful, but it's the best way that we can be inclusive of everybody that falls within the LGBTQ umbrella. So advising organizations on opening up their programming, ensuring they're considering these communities, doing advocacy towards, not general advocacy towards the public, but towards, HQ level to ensure that they have the tools and policies to include these communities. Part of my role is to do legal analysis on what the laws in these countries say and what is and isn't possible in terms of programming, mapping out LGBTQ organizations in the environment that could be worked with, and then also looking at internal procedures and tools to ensure that staff, including staff who identify as LGBTQ, are safe in these environments. And we are in a pilot phase of our project right now, which is focusing on 6 countries: Kenya, Uganda, the DRC, Burundi, Malawi, and Nigeria. And I know that people in this call, some of you probably work in those countries, some of you probably work outside of those countries. But I think something that I've really realized in starting to do this work, and particularly in researching the legal frameworks, is just how much there is in common across the continent, and how much some of the lessons that I've been learning about what is and isn't possible under the law is actually consistent across many of the countries that we're looking at, and even the countries that we aren't. So one of, I think my biggest takeaway that probably is what Jessica took away from the meeting that we held in Nairobi, something that has been so eye-opening to me over the 10 months that I've been really trying to immerse myself in the laws of these different countries, is that I would have thought so I live in Nairobi. I'm just not there right now, but I've lived there for about 10 years, and I have always worked in gender and gender-based violence. And my assumption, so my role at the International Pride Center is to try to help organizations really to navigate the legal frameworks in each of these countries. So when you have very restrictive laws, how can you be inclusive of LGBT communities, right? And looking at the countries that we operate in, I thought, okay, Kenya's going to have laws that are sort of like 50-50. Some of the programming will be illegal, some of it will be illegal, some of it will be a gray area. And my role will be advising organizations on how to navigate their way through. When we look at Uganda, I thought everything's going to be illegal. And our role will be how to help organizations come up with creative strategies to try to navigate around that illegality, through partnerships or through indirect ways of targeting the community. And after 10 months of really going through all of the laws, all of the relevant laws, one of the things we do is we produce these legal analyses that look at all of the laws that discriminate against the community and all of the laws that provide some level of protection in each country. And my takeaway now is that in Kenya, everything is legal. It is perfectly legal to serve these communities. All types of, service provision, protection, whatever it is that your organization provides is allowed under the law. In Uganda, that's the country that's about 50-50. And where, you do have to be careful what's in a gray zone and how to, come up with creative strategies to navigate your way through. And that isn't to say that just because it's legal doesn't mean it's not controversial. And that's something that I'll talk about at the end is, there's other concerns, safety, political, social concerns about doing this work. But in most countries, serving these communities is not only legal, but often actively protected by the law. And so that's what we're going to look at now. So if we look at the countries across Africa where same-sex intimacy is criminalized, I think I had read a lot about how there is this sweep of anti-LGBTQ laws recently across the African continent. And that is true. I mean, there is this very concerted anti-gender movement that originates here in the US, where I am right now, that is spending a lot of money on trying to push anti-LGBTQ agendas across Africa. The research shows that the money that is spent on pushing anti-gender, anti-LGBTQ causes globally is 3 times the amount that is available for LGBTQ groups globally, and that is more pronounced in Africa. So LGBTQ focused organizations get less than 0.1% of total development and international aid assistance, whereas the anti-gender movement has been spending tens of millions of dollars in recent years trying to push anti-LGBTQ laws across the country. But if we look at the places where same-sex intimacy is criminalized right now, which is all of these countries on the map, most of those laws are not these this new wave of laws that have been proposed. Most of those laws have been proposed, but not passed. The laws that we're working with generally have been in place for decades. Many of them are left by the former colonizers. So this second map is where the former colonial powers have just left the previous law in place. All but 2 of these are the British colonial law, and that law is the exact same law across countries. So it is something that I feel like I've traveled all over the continent and even outside and just encountered the exact same wording of the law in each place. And we're going to have a look at what that says in a second. And then this final map is where that new wave of anti-LGBTQ, but very sort of hostile and aggressive anti-LGBTQ laws have been passed. And so if we're looking at what these different types of law says, the ones that have been left by the British criminalize carnal knowledge against the order of nature, as it describes it, which most courts have found means any kind of sexual intercourse that is outside of involving a penis and vagina, punishable by 14 years imprisonment, and of course disproportionately used against men who have sex with men. These laws have exclusive focus on same-sex intimacy between men. Many of them don't criminalize same-sex intimacy between women, or that's something that they've added in with a lower sentence later. And actually, now that I have kind of traveled across a few of these countries that have that exact same colonial era British law in place, most of them tell me the same thing, which is that mostly people that are, harassed and arrested under these laws, then that doesn't happen using the anti-homosexuality provisions. It happens using the vagrancy or idly and disorderly provisions, because they're very broad and sort of were created by the colonizers to just criminalize people that they didn't like the look of, basically people that were begging, people that were engaged in sex work, people that were loitering in public places. And so those kind of broad powers give police the ability to just go after people that they feel look queer in public places, whereas the homosexuality provisions require evidence of actual same-sex activity. So those ones are used more. So there is a movement across Africa at the moment to get those vagrancy laws repealed on the basis that they basically criminalize poverty. You know, they criminalize people that are begging, people that are homeless. And in many African countries, the Constitutional Court has been striking them down for being unconstitutional. There are the other penal codes, other than the British, that criminalize same-sex intimacy, generally do so for, you know, they don't have that same kind of obsessive focus on just same-sex intimacy between men. They might criminalize same-sex intimacy between men and between women, and usually with a much, much lower sentence. But they will also have these, you know, their equivalent of the vagrancy provisions, you know, immorality, indecency, something vague that is often more commonly used than the anti-homosexuality provisions to target and harass the community. But I think what's really important to note about these laws is that they make life very scary for people who are from the LGBTQ community, especially people who are trying to carry on relationships, because it does criminalize them directly. They do not criminalize anything that would be related to an organization providing services. That's just not their target. Their target is on individuals, the sexual conduct they engage in, and sometimes, when interpreted really broadly and misused, the way that those individuals kind of express themselves in public places. But again, if someone was to come and offer services to those provisions, a safe space, medical care, that is not criminalized, and as we will see in a second, is actually protected under the law. The real issue is with this new wave of anti-LGBTQ laws that criminalize the promotion of homosexuality, and that's what we see in the Ugandan law. These laws are generally written by these anti-gender campaigners based in the global north, heavily influenced and funded by them. And so you will see in these laws fixation on these kind of moral panic issues that are very prevalent in places like the US, but aren't really a topic of discussion in the region that we all work in. So the early versions of these laws, which started to be written in the early 2000s, generally had a focus on prohibiting same-sex marriage, even though that's not really a topic of discussion in most of these countries. And more recent laws have a focus on trans issues, you know, like trans women in bathrooms, trans people in sport, things like that. The draft law that has been proposed in Kenya, for example, has a minimum 10-year prison sentence for anybody who uses a bathroom of someone of the opposite sex. So these new laws are very draconian, and as I said, have only been passed so far in a handful of cases. But I think, unfortunately, that is something that may change in the future. Yeah, sorry. And this is kind of the thing that is very relevant to us about those promotion laws, is that unlike the previous criminal laws that were in place, the new wave of laws focusing on promotion can criminalize organizational programming if that programming is seen to promote homosexuality. And we're going to look at exactly the Ugandan law as the one that is the first one that was passed that has this promotion clause in it, and is the one that defines it in most detail. So we're going to have a look at what that says. But I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think it's really relevant to note, and something that I have been learning so much about, is that it's not just in Kenya, but Kenya's Constitutional Court is, for those of you who work in Kenya, you may know, very robust in protecting people's rights. And human rights lawyers in Kenya are extremely active about suing the government every time they feel that a human rights violation has occurred. So it's not just that these countries have laws in place that criminalize LGBTQ people or discriminate against them. All of the countries also have laws that protect them in some way, starting with the constitutions. All of the countries across the region have constitutions that actually look quite similar. and protect a range of rights that you will find in most, international human rights laws. If you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the list of rights that exist there are very similar to the laws that exist in most of these constitutions. And that has resulted in actually laws against same-sex intimacy being struck down in many parts of the continent. If you remember that map I showed you just before, there is not a lot of shading in the southern part of Africa, and that's because most of those countries have repealed anti-homosexuality laws on the basis that they are unconstitutional. In many more countries, the Constitutional Court has found that LGBTQ organizations have the right to exist and carry out their activities. That's happened in Kenya, Nigeria, Mauritius, many countries from the north to the south. There's kind of been a wave of courts deciding that LGBTQ organizations have a right to exist and operate. And in Kenya, there's been a multitude of cases protecting trans people, protecting intersex people, finding that LGBTQ organizations have the right to exist, putting injunctions out to stop anti-gender protesters committing violence against LGBTQ people. And if you're interested in having a look at where else those types of rulings exist, there is an organization called the Southern African Litigation Center based in South Africa, and it produces a compendium of cases across the continent that protect different types of human rights, including LGBTQ rights. And if you go to the contents page of that and have a look at which countries have passed laws to protect LGBTQ people, I think you'll be surprised to find how many there are. I was shocked. There are multitudes of cases across the entire continent that are protecting this community in some way. The other laws that I think are really relevant to go and have a look at in your own country, so I've just had a look at them in the 6 countries that we look at, but is the HIV laws and policies in each place. So the public health actors really have been extremely effective in working with the different governments to convince them that certain categories of LGBTQ people, namely men who have sex with men and trans people, are at a higher risk of HIV, so called in public health parlance key populations, and that they therefore need specific programming directed at them that will enable them to access treatment and help manage the HIV if they have it. And every country that I've looked at so far has accepted this and has incorporated men who have sex with men and transgender people in as key populations within their HIV policies. So even Uganda recognizes these as populations that require special assistance. The Nigerian policy, and Nigeria is quite a scary country for many LGBTQ people. But the Nigerian policy, they have a government policy on programming for men who have sex with men. And the forward for that policy is written by the director of the National AIDS Commission, who recognizes in the forward that internalized homophobia, which he calls out, internalized homophobia is a reason for the spread of HIV and something that needs to be combated in Nigerian institutions. And they say that their policy previously only recognized men who have sex with men as key populations, but they need to use the evidence base that they have built up with men who have sex with men and apply it to transgender people. So behind the scenes, these governments are having many conversations with different international actors about sort of just acknowledging that these populations exist within their countries. Many of them quantify it. You can see there on the screen, Kenya says there's 50,000 men who have sex with men and 5,000 trans people in Kenya. I mean, there's more, but, Malawi, 35,000 men who have sex with men, 4,900 trans people. So really acknowledging these populations exist and putting down in policy that there needs to be special programs in place for them to be able to access healthcare services. And each of these policies also contain protections against discrimination for the communities when they do. So I just want to play, this is a clip from the head of a lesbian-run organization in Nigeria. And it just speaks to, I think, and I'm using Nigeria because I just wanted to use somewhere that's outside of the region that we're discussing today. But I guarantee you that in every country, I've had the same experience of talking to leaders of LGBTQ organizations who say we're doing this programming all the time. We provide services for GBV survivors from the community. We provide them healthcare services. We provide shelters. We do education programs, livelihood programs, the whole suite of humanitarian programming for LGBTQ people. And that mostly doing that is completely legal. And then I talk to the humanitarian organizations, and they have the very understandable misconception that it's not possible to do any of this, but it is being done. There's people who are doing it every day. And so just to listen to, her name is Akudo.
My name is Akudo Ogwaramba, and I'm the Executive Director of Women's Health and Equal Rights Initiative. So last year, we challenged the Nigerian police in court after they made online statements referring to our work as criminalized. In court, they argued that operating an LGBTIQ plus organization was a criminal offense. We relied on a recent legal precedent. We successfully demonstrated that having such an organization, LGBTIQ plus organization, is not criminalized. The court dismissed the case and importantly clarified that being gay, trans, or otherwise, and that LGBTIQ is not a crime in Nigeria.
So that's Akudo talking about how, not only is it legal to do this, to be LGBTQ in Nigeria and also to do programming for LGBTQ people, but when the police, it was on Twitter, I believe, sort of tweeted there was a viral TikTok. There was a viral TikTok challenge going around where people were recording videos in which they identified as queer. The police commented on those videos saying this is illegal. And then they took the police to court, and the court found against the police, saying you can't be commenting that this type of programming is illegal when it is actually protected under Nigerian law. Then when I went and spoke to the humanitarians, these are some of the responses. So I always ask them, do you do any programming that directly reaches out to LGBTQ people? And generally the answer to that question is no. And then I ask them about why, what are the barriers? And you'll see these answers here, under Nigerian law, it is not permissible to identify as LGBTQI. That is a huge barrier. There is a punishment of 14 years imprisonment for being associated with LGBTQI people, which is, I think, a misconception that many people have that I would have had before I started looking into these laws, but is not correct. I am not sure if it is legal for humanitarians to target this group. There would be legal repercussions for doing this work. And the last one, I can't imagine we would force team members to stand up against a law that's referring to, if we did this work, we would be forcing the people in our organizations to be breaking the law. But in fact, the law allows for this in the vast majority of these countries. And then sometimes the people that I talk to in these countries, and I'm sure many of you may relate to this, are sort of like, oh my God, thank God you've come and spoken to us about this issue, because I've been thinking about this. I receive these cases all the time and I don't know what to do with them. So this was another response from Nigeria where somebody said, she was a protection person. And she said, yeah, I'm constantly getting these cases. She was very very clearly warm, open-minded person. And I believe that the reason that she probably ended up getting so many of these cases referred to her is because people felt safe raising them to her, which I think is a really interesting, form of best practice, just making it very obvious to your team and to the people that you work with that you're very open to receiving these cases. And she said, she didn't know what to do with them when she received them. She talked to her team. They said they were also receiving them. So then she went and did her own research and found a list of LGBTQI organizations operating that she, suggested be incorporated into the referral pathways at the GBV AOR. And originally was met with the response that, I think any of the organizations that are already in the referral pathways could respond to these cases. But as she said, I don't think that's true. And in my experience now, I also don't think that's accurate. I think that LGBTQ people who've experienced GBV will feel they really will want to know that the organization that they are being referred to understands their specific experiences and is skilled at responding them to directly. After experiencing violence and trauma, being referred to an organization that might not understand, that might, subject them to demeaning questions, which is something that they're so used to, is probably a reason for them to not seek further help. And so I think this is an example of something that is quite easy for organizations to do. There is a lot of gaps, and some of those gaps, will take time and money and effort to fill. But finding local LGBTQ organizations that always exist, even if really informally. I mean, a country like Nigeria has over 200. In other places, it will be illegal or it would be extremely repressive and they'll be harder to find, but they always exist. And so finding these organizations and referring people to them is something that, I think is a lower hanging fruit in terms of responding to these types of cases. Okay, I know I'm running out of time, but I just really quickly wanted to end by talking about what the Ugandan law says, but just because it is the most hostile anti-gay law in the whole world. And so if something is, permitted under the Ugandan law, then you can be pretty sure it will be permitted elsewhere as well. So as I mentioned before, the Ugandan law departs from the previous anti-homosexuality laws in Africa by criminalizing the promotion of homosexuality. And it still does have parts of, like, the Ugandan Constitutional Court is in a really tough spot because this is such a political hot button issue. But even in Uganda, the Constitutional Court has struck down some parts of the law. There previously was a legal duty to report on these cases. That has been struck down by the Constitutional Court, as has the criminalization of landlords for renting space for people that, are considered to be doing homosexual acts. The death penalty for transmission of terminal illness via homosexual acts. So those are all parts of the Anti-Homosexuality Act have been struck down. And Uganda had also previously struck down all of its vagrancy and idly and disorderly laws. And that has made a huge difference, actually, because even in Uganda, the way that LGBTQ people were getting most commonly harassed and targeted by police was still not actually using the Anti-Homosexuality Act. It was using these vagrancy and idle and disorderly provisions because they it's, kind of just target the way that someone's presenting themselves. So the striking down of those laws by the Constitutional Court was actually had a significant protective effect for the community. But when we just look at what, this term, the promotion of homosexuality, it really sounds like it's talking about the promotion of, the homosexual lifestyle. But if you look at the way that the Act defines homosexuality, it defines it as the performance of a sexual act by one person on another person of the same sex. So it's not homosexuality as an identity. It's the act of homosexuality. So when they say promotion, it's, are you promoting two people of the same sex to have sex with each other? That's what the law is criminalizing. And it even specifies in the law a person who is alleged or suspected of being homosexual, sort of, someone that is gay, does not commit that offense of homosexuality. It is only criminalizing the same-sex act. And then if you look at what the other part of that provision is on promotion, promotion means encourages or persuades another person to perform a same-sex sexual act. Advertises, publishes, prints, broadcasts, distributes material promoting or encouraging. It says homosexuality, but we know that means encouraging people of the same sex to have sex. And then the last two are, I think, especially nerve-wracking for organizations, providing financial support to facilitate activities that encourage homosexual acts again, or operating an organization that does that. But again, even in Uganda, there has been there's protective laws and policies in place, and there's been quite an effort actually where the government is constantly reiterating, we're not talking about identifying as gay, we're talking about the criminalization of same-sex acts, which is very, again, scary for people who are trying to carry on same-sex relations. But for us as programmers and organizations, that distinction does matter. There is the Constitution that, as I said, has been used to strike down the parts of the law. There's a 2023 circular issued by the Ministry of Health that specifies that all healthcare services must be provided without discrimination, including discrimination based on sexual orientation. There's a prosecution circular that clarifies again that the Act only criminalizes offenses where sexual acts have been performed and urges police officers to act with caution when considering charging someone under the Act. There's HIV law and policy that recognizes gay people and men who have and trans people as key populations. And then earlier this year came the World Bank mitigating measures, where the government agreed with the World Bank to put in place a range of mitigating measures to ensure that LGBTQ people were not discriminated against in relation to World Bank funded projects. And that meant that the government had to issue more directives saying that LGBTQ people were not allowed to be discriminated against, had to be protected. There was mandatory training for people in the government on this, explicit requirements for LGBTQ inclusion, and the setting up of M&E and complaints receiving mechanisms if queer people did feel that they had been discriminated against, that they had somewhere to complain. And I'm not insinuating by this that these measures are enough to ensure that LGBTQ people aren't discriminated in Uganda. I think the existence of a law like that there and the sort of, I guess, opinions that has generated means that you can't really ensure that people are protected from discrimination. But it just indicates that the World Bank has been able to go to the government, talk to them about this, and convince them to issue a range of mitigating measures to ensure the community isn't discriminated against, as have the public health actors. And so there is more room for discussion of these issues and, putting protective measures in place to address these issues than you would expect, even in the country where it is the most legally dangerous to identify as gay. And the last thing I'll just say is that I am very aware that just because something is illegal doesn't mean it is possible to do. There are, often very, very legitimate concerns about backlash. Police will often harass members of the community, even knowing that there aren't any real laws in place, because it's an easy way to, extort and exploit. It may be that socially it's just very, risky or dangerous to discuss these issues. But I know that, people in this call are generally GBV experts and will, may recall or may know that 20 years ago, there was not a focus on gender-based violence in humanitarian programming. It's something that kind of went on behind the scenes and wasn't acknowledged when it came to UN agencies or INGOs coming to provide humanitarian assistance to populations. And we've made so much progress in the last 20 years, acknowledging that this is an issue everywhere and navigating around some of the challenges, even when the laws are restrictive or where the social environment makes it really difficult. So these two statements here are things that I have heard over and over again about why it's really hard to do programming for LGBTQ people, including a lack of data and invisibility of these populations. And also that it's, because if you don't have data, you can't act, but then you also can't collect data because you can't just walk into a refugee camp and ask, who here is gay. But these are barriers that were kind of very similar for GBV programming a couple of decades ago and continue to exist to this day, right? It's very hard to know how many people in a given area or refugee camp, IDP camp, wherever it might be, have experienced gender-based violence. And it is that lack of data is something that persists across all contexts. And yet we found ways to work around that, right? We found ways to just assume that a particular percentage of a population will have been subjected to gender-based violence. We've got these, stats of 1 in 4 women globally have experienced this. And if you think about your own organizations, the way that you have put mechanisms in place to respond to this threat, even if you don't have the data to hand. And I think that's something that we can think about doing for LGBTQ populations. Something the International Pride Center estimates very conservatively is that at least 5% of any population will be LGBTQ. So can we use this assumption, see, okay, if it's 5%, how many people that we're interacting with on a day-to-day basis are likely to be from the community, and then start putting programming mechanisms in place to respond to their needs, even before we know exactly who they are. Okay, So I think I'll stop there. Sorry, I know I've gone a little bit over time, but thank you so much. And I'd be really, interested if anyone has any questions.
Thank you, Claire. That was really insightful. And we do have a few questions that I will pose. We're going to close the questions for now in the chat because I do think the ones that we have curated will bring us to the end of the hour. Let me start with how do we had a question, how do we request your support? If we are working, for instance, for another big INGO who needs more, either training or also just education around this issue. Is that something that the International Pride Center provides?
Yes, great question. 100%. That's why we exist. So we're still finding our feet in terms of what the best way is to support organizations like yours. So actually, we would love to kind of have a conversation and tailor our support to whatever it is people need, because I think our assumptions so far on after talking to some organizations is workshops. So that's something that we have been doing. Jessica mentioned one we did a couple of weeks ago. We have another 2 coming up in Nairobi. But if people want workshops in other parts of the country, we can also go and provide workshops there. We can also come into we've got some money in the budget to come into your office directly and do like a mini workshop just with you. But also, if you have other suggestions of things that you might need, whether that be one of the things we want to put together is how-to guides. So if you have something that you really think, okay, I need to know specifically how to do this, and you want to give us a suggestion, we're very flexible to molding that to what you think your needs might be. And then, like standard operating procedures, sort of checklist that you can follow. So the answer to your question is yes, you can request our help. Our whole purpose is to provide that help to you, and you can also tell us what would be most helpful to you, because at this point we're still like very flexible to shaping our programming, and we would really like to be responsive to your needs.
Great. And maybe Claire, you can provide the contact information in the chat, just so I know we'll get that quite a bit. Another question, and maybe while Claire, you're providing that in the chat, I might be able to help with these. One is, you had mentioned that one of the, maybe, I don't want to say easy ways, but low-hanging fruit you mentioned is ensuring that caseworkers in your organizations are open to serving LGBTQI plus populations. And that might not be everybody on staff, which we recognize. And we also had a colleague from the DRC, a local organization, said, this seems really overwhelming when we have cultural and beliefs and laws all seemingly against us. What can we do as kind of a first step? And maybe I'll answer this very briefly, but then maybe also to get your opinion, Claire. I think that issue around having caseworkers in the confidential settings who are showing empathy and kindness and being good people, in a way, is how we often say this, right? Towards all range of survivors, particularly those who are LGBTQI. This is a good first step to make sure that your organization is open, and really having some thoughtful conversations with your colleagues to say, are we though? Because as Claire said, we create those referral pathways, and the assumption is, because we work in this field, that we are without discrimination. And we know that is not true. And so we have to think very critically internally about our own organizations and our willingness. And do we create an environment which is open? I will say that the interagency GBV case management guidelines, we do now have an addendum to those, and there is a module that very specifically looks at how we can provide more tailored services to LGBTQI plus populations. So note that is on our website, the gbvaor.net website, or the gbvims.com. I'll put those in the chat. There is a specific module on LGBTQI, how to make sure that you as a caseworker are being as open and reflective as possible. Claire, anything else what are your thoughts on just some very basic first steps? Because I know for some of our local organizations, it does seem a bit overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I think two things. First of all, I completely agree with what you were just saying. And I have found such a big difference in conducting these interviews with organizations between people who say like, oh, I've never heard of any of these cases, but, I like, sure, we'd be open to receiving them, but I just don't think that that's not an issue, or they don't exist. Accidentally and without meaning to, people that are dismissive of the possibility that these cases are out there will mean that anybody who might want to refer those cases to them, or raise this as a concern, will feel less comfortable doing so. Whereas this person who was saying, I get these cases all the time, is very obvious that she said things like, when anybody says anything homophobic, I just say that's not funny and I leave the room. And I think that creates this aura around her that people identify, okay, she is someone that I can approach with these issues. And I think just kind of being aware of your own behavior in the workplace can, without you maybe even realizing it, she maybe didn't even realize that she had been identified as someone that was safe to bring these cases to, but here she was receiving all these cases. Whereas other people that I spoke to, they weren't being actively hostile, but they were just being dismissive without meaning to, just honestly, because without knowing that there were these cases out there, and it meant that people didn't identify them as a safe person that these issues could be raised to. So I think that's something that everybody can just do, in terms of their own attitudes and like behavior within the workplace. But I think the other really big one is, and this is something that we can help with, is partnering or having referral pathways to LGBTQ specific organizations. They are everywhere. They do these cases all the time. They were probably already known by queer people in the context that you're working in as people that can be trusted. And they are like very professional about receiving and dealing with these cases. So we can, depending on where you work, if you work in one of our focus countries, we can definitely facilitate those introductions as well.
Great. And Claire, that brings me to the next question, which you answered in part. One of our participants asked, is there an up-to-date database of LGBTQI plus organizations in humanitarian contexts that are still operating? Just because we know in the funding cuts that a lot of organizations, over to you.
Yeah. So no, there isn't. And I think that's one of the big gaps. That is something that we had originally wanted to do as part of our program. But what we've realized is it is a security risk to have just a database of these organizations, right, in the current climate. So instead, in the conversations that we work, we have our own database, but we're not making it publicly available because that could lead to security risks. But if you work in one of the countries that we do, then we are very happy to facilitate those introductions. I will agree that so many of these organizations have really been decimated by the funding cuts at the beginning of the year, because a lot of them got their funding through HIV funding streams. But most of them are still working, because I guess that's the thing about being sort of an organization that's from the community. Like, you can't abandon the community that you work for because you are it. So we have met with many organizations who aren't getting paid salaries anymore, who have no scary lack of money, and who are just continuing to serve their communities. And so I do think that they need more support as well. And the process of facilitating these introductions hopefully won't only mean that organizations do have local LGBTQ organizations that they can easily refer people to and work with, but maybe facilitating some of those partnerships mean that they can get more support as well.
Good. Thanks, Claire. I have two remaining questions. I know we have about 8 minutes left in the hour. One, and these are very specific questions. One is, we had a participant that said, thank you for explaining promotion, but what is your take on the meaning of the aspect of normalization when you talk about parts of the Ugandan law that you have cited?
Okay, that is a great question. The normalization parts are that's related to the activities of organizations, which obviously does make it very concerning for us as humanitarians organizations trying to do programming. Again, it is the normalization of sexual acts, not homosexuality as an identity. But I do think that is there. I mean, I don't think that there's necessarily a huge difference between promotion and normalization, because at the end of the day, both of those words are incredibly broad and vague. And what we've actually seen in Uganda is that most of them don't get to a final conviction. Actually, if you look at how many like if you look at cases where people have been arrested for the promotion of homosexuality in Uganda, there have been no convictions. And this is why people, I think police, they do tend to rely more on those other sections of the penal code, which are less broad and vague. It's actually quite difficult to make a case stick when you have these terms that don't really mean anything. And so I think what actually happens at the end of the day is that the existence of these laws makes it really easy to harass, exploit, and extort the community, because you've got this very scary law there. The police can easily use it to go and like conduct mass arrests. But when you look at it happens as it like progresses, if it does progress through the courts, they generally get lost somewhere along the way, because what does it mean to normalize? What does it mean to promote? Courts don't like making convictions on something that is that vague. And I think that's something to keep in mind because that distinction doesn't really make a difference if you're an LGBTQ person. Like the fact that it might not end up in a conviction, and that, actually it's so broad that courts find it really difficult, you'll still get arrested, you'll still get exploited and extorted. But I think it does make a difference for organizations. Like, yes, it makes everything a gray area. What is promotion? What is normalization? What is an organization that normalizes same-sex activity? It's so gray. And that means that we do have to tread really carefully, but just keeping in mind, it very rarely goes anywhere legally, and organizations have much more resilience than an individual person does to just kind of like, forge your way through and do this programming anyway. And that kind of also depends on the size of the organization. Of course, international organizations have more of an ability to just kind of forge through. If you're a local organization, then you probably are more scared of getting arrested and harassed. But yeah, I think the purpose of the law, whether it's promotion or normalization, is to just be so broad that it can be easily used to harass people, even if not eventually convict them.
Great. Thank you, Claire. And our last question, I know we have a couple of questions that were posed in French. Adish, did you want to ask the last one?
One question came from DRC regarding the difficulty of access to service when the community is ostracized and harassed. So how they can find them, that's one way, but also how to have it accepted as well for these services to be accessed without having to hide. That was one question.
I mean, again, I think the local LGBTQ organizations, I think I have learned so much about when I go and talk to both LGBTQ CSOs and populations, maybe populations existing in refugee camps, or often they've exited the refugee camp because it's too dangerous for them to be there, and they're sort of like congregated somewhere else. Because these communities are so marginalized and vulnerable, it is so common for them to kind of congregate in the same place, and absolutely for them to know which organizations will serve them. So they are receiving services constantly from local LGBTQ organizations. The number of services that these organizations are providing is usually mind-blowing, considering how little resources that they have. So it's not that the community is not coming to access services, it's just that they will only do it from people that they trust. And I think forging more of those connections between mainstream organizations and local organizations that are serving these communities but have no resources is really important.
Thanks, Claire. I think that's a really great note to end on. One that is, organizations need to build trust among the community in order for us to better service LGBTQI populations. And also noting we do have a lot of implementing partners on the line, that it is up to us to make sure that our programs and policies are inclusive, but also open. We can even say that we have policies in existence, but if we as the individual caseworker are not open, then of course, any survivor will understand that. And they're going to not feel that this is a place they can come and safely access services. So it's up to each one of us to make sure that we're doing that in an ethical and safe way, not only because of ourselves, but also on behalf of our survivors. So let's take that as a key takeaway, I think, from this discussion. of course, in addition to many of the others that Claire has introduced. Claire put her information in the chat. If you are an organization that would like additional information or resources, please do reach out to the International Pride Center. As I mentioned, I did attend a workshop a couple weeks ago and found it really eye-opening. And I'm so glad that, Claire, you were able to join us today, because I know you're in another place altogether, and your schedule was quite complex. So thank you very much to Claire. Thanks, of course, to all our member organizations, particularly to UNICEF for providing simultaneous interpretation today. I see we have many of our member organizations on the line, which we always appreciate your support here at the Regional GBV Working Group for East and Southern Africa. Thanks to Adish and Shiva, my colleagues from both Geneva and here in Nairobi, for providing additional support. Please keep an eye out. We will be giving the schedule for the upcoming 16 Days of Activism campaign. We do have some new videos in line, which we're excited about. And of course, we will be able to also provide a new series of webinars. The campaign this year, the global campaign, is on digital GBV, or tech-related gender-based violence. We will be addressing that here in East and Southern Africa, but we're also going to be addressing some bigger issues, and that is our field and where we're going as a community, and how we also have to be very strong in these times to make sure that we're upholding these rights on behalf of women and girls and others who might not have the platforms that we do to do this. So thanks, everybody. I really appreciate you joining. Please do join us next month for our next emerging webinar series. And then also please keep an eye out for our 16 Days of Activism campaign. We'll be coming out with some more insights on that soon. So thanks again to Claire, and thanks everybody for joining. And I hope you have a really great afternoon wherever you are.
Sorry, could I just say one more thing?
Please do.
Actually, for those of you who are interested in doing a workshop, especially if you're based in Nairobi, we are doing 2 more in the week of the 15th of November. So if you would like to come, please email me and we'll work it out.
Excellent. Even better. Thanks a lot, Claire. And thanks to everybody for joining. Have a great afternoon and a wonderful week.